Carl's Jr. gearing up to test a CBD-infused burger at one of its Denver locations.
It's hard to be pessimistic about marijuana legalization these days. Recreational cannabis is legal in 10 states and decriminalized in another 14. Virtually all presidential candidates, including President Trump, favor letting states decide the legal status of marijuana. For the first time, polls show a majority of Republicans supporting legalization. And 6 proposals to move marijuana in a more or less libertarian direction are now making their way through Congress. What do these policy proposals look like? How are states navigating the conflicts between state and federal law? And are there any obstacles left on the path to nationwide legalization? I sat down with Eric Altieri, the executive director of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, to talk about the building momentum towards nationwide legal pot. So not to sound overly optimistic about this, but there are 6 policy proposals floating through Congress right now that seek to transform marijuana policy in a really positive direction. I'm wondering, what is your take on all of them generally, and is there any one in particular, one or two in particular, that strikes you as better than the others?
I think unquestionably the momentum is on the side of legalization supporters at this point in history, with 10 states having legalized adult use of marijuana, 33 states with medical use programs, and as you mentioned, a historic number of proposals at the federal level that would finally bring prohibition to an end across this country. It's really exciting to see, and particularly this year, we've seen more action than we've ever seen, in that we've already had our very first in history hearing on a pro-cannabis bill, and that was the marijuana banking bill that just moved through committee. And that was approved and will likely be approved on the House floor sometime soon. And in addition to that, we're expecting that this year we will finally have hearings and votes on bills that would ultimately end marijuana prohibition, and they all attempt to do it in slightly different ways. But from the House side, it's without a doubt the year that we're going to start seeing that ball move forward. We have several avenues which that can proceed on. One of the proposals that is out there and being discussed is the States Act, which is arguably the least ambitious of the proposals. This would simply create an exemption in federal law that would allow states who have changed their policy to do so without federal incursion. It doesn't remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. It doesn't change anything in regards to research availability. It doesn't change much in relation to banking or taxation for marijuana businesses. But the states would at least not have fear that, federal boots on the ground are something that could happen in the near future for them. Next up the list is the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act, which is a very clean bill. It would simply deschedule marijuana entirely out of the Controlled Substances Act. That would lead to fixing the issues of banking and taxation. That would help lead to clearing up the issues of research and the ability for people to look into the benefits and potential harms of the substance, and really end a federal prohibition nationwide, much in the way that alcohol prohibition was ended. It wouldn't immediately legalize marijuana in every single state, much like ending federal alcohol prohibition did not do that for alcohol, but states would be free to move forward, and states that chose to keep their prohibition laws would be allowed to do so too. And then on the further, more ambitious end, you have bills like the Marijuana Justice Act from Senator Cory Booker and Representative Barbara Lee. This really looks to both deschedule marijuana, but also begin to pursue reparative justice for communities that were most harmed by marijuana prohibition. So overwhelmingly, as most people know by now, marijuana prohibition's effects fall disproportionately on communities of color. Black and brown Americans are arrested at 4 times or higher the rate of white Americans, despite using at the same rates. The over-policing of their communities has done untold damage to them. And this would look to refund those communities with investments from the taxation. It would look to penalize states that continue racist applications in their arrests, and begin to have that very oriented discussion around social and racial justice. And these are all very much in play, and as you can tell, particularly from the Democratic side of things, this is where the party is moving. Essentially, every single candidate that is running for president on the Democratic side that is currently serving in Congress is on one or all of these bills, from Bernie Sanders down to Beto O'Rourke and everyone in between. They're all supporting ending federal prohibition, with the exception of Joe Biden, who's not quite in the race yet, but he's the exception, not the rule here. And we're beginning to see that Republicans are also becoming much more favorable to ending marijuana prohibition. The States Act that we just talked about, that was partially led by Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado. The Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act in the House is co-sponsored by Don Young, the longest-serving Republican in Congress in the House. So it's slowly becoming a bipartisan issue politically at the elected level that we are seeing as well at the public level, where we finally see over 50% of Republican voters also support legalizing marijuana.
And maybe just as important is some of the institutional changes, like proposed banking legislation, for example.
By and large, currently, certainly all large banking institutions are avoiding doing business with any sort of marijuana business. And sometimes that's individuals that are directly, touching the plant to people who are only ancillary industries. And that's because they do fear, because of this state and federal law conflict, they could be charged with anything from RICO suits to you name it, that would jeopardize their broader business. So they're very risk adverse when it comes to marijuana. We are seeing a few local credit unions and things of that sort starting to open their doors to those businesses. And it's really important that we solve that because, as you noted, that marijuana businesses in legal states now are essentially a cash-only enterprise. At the end of the day, they take their thousands of dollars and they stick it in a safe in the back of the building. When they need to go, pay their deposits or pay their taxes, they have to hire armored vehicles. Some folks I talk to running these businesses have to do different routes every time that they map out to make sure people aren't targeting them for robbery. It opens them up for obviously all sorts of criminal elements coming into the business itself, attempting to rob them because they know they're cash heavy. It also creates a problem just from a regulatory standpoint where we don't have a great idea of being able to track this money in the way we could with any other legal enterprise. We don't necessarily know how it's coming in, where it's going out, that they're keeping the books accordingly, because those are all just flaws inherent in a cash-only business. So that is something that ultimately really needs to be fixed. Along with part and parcel with that is the taxation issue. Marijuana businesses currently can't write off many business expenses that any other business could. And because of the fact that they don't have access to banking, they're paying most of their taxes in cash. And the IRS assesses a penalty if you pay your taxes in cash, so they're not allowed to pay their taxes in cash, and then they're charged even more for that privilege of paying in cash that they're forced into anyway. So it's really creating a lot of problems for what is clearly becoming a huge industry in this country. The most recent reports we have, legal cannabis employs more individuals than the coal industry, than the textile industry. There's hundreds of thousands of Americans working in good-paying jobs related to cannabis right now. And we need to, really support those businesses so we can see the economic benefits instead of treating them like they're still some criminal enterprise.
Tell me about the new Attorney General.
There's certainly no sadness amongst the marijuana community to see our former beleaguered Attorney General Jefferson Beauregard Sessions go. He clearly had nothing but disdain for marijuana and any reforms to the law.
Colorado was one of the leading states that started the movement to suggest that marijuana is not dangerous. And we're going to find it, in my opinion, ripple throughout the entire American citizenry, and we're going to see more marijuana use, and it's not going to be good.
Fortunately for us, his bark was always worse than his bite. In practice, he never got to really implement any crackdown that he always hinted he wanted. So now we have Attorney General Barr for the time being, and he seems to be a bit more pragmatic on the issue. Time will certainly tell. But just recently, he was asked about it in his hearings in front of Congress this week. And he said that he would love to see something like the States Act or one of these other bills move forward to clean up this tension.
We either should have a federal law that prohibits marijuana everywhere, which I would support myself, because I think it's a mistake to back off on marijuana. However, if we want a federal approach, if we want states to have their own laws, then let's get there, and let's get there the right way.
Ultimately, whether you believe them or not, attorney generals are tasked with enforcing the law as it's written. And what if you remove the issue of the law and you say that these states are allowed to move forward with these new policies, I think someone like Barr would go along with that and would listen to both the law and the will of the overwhelming majority of Americans and keep a hands-off policy.
Yeah, but to be clear, he is a drug warrior, right?
He is a drug warrior, as we saw during his time with former President Bush. He was very much a just say no type, let's amp up prosecutions, let's arrest people for possession. But, like many others, as we've seen with people like John Boehner and others, time seems to change people. And they're not immune to the climate around marijuana policy in this country. I think they know where the American people are moving on this. They see where state policies are going. And it's really rare to see someone like a Jeff Sessions that's still really willing to plant their flag and die on this hill.
Particularly when the president wasn't supportive of that policy in particular. Right?
Yes. Donald Trump's a bit of an enigma on this. He's said all kinds of very surprising, like most issues, he says all kinds of different things on it. Ultimately, we feel he just doesn't really care. He doesn't seem to prioritize this issue one way or another. On the campaign trail, he said he saw it as a states' rights issue. He particularly was supportive of the idea of medical marijuana. We did get mixed messages when he's appointing people like Jeff Sessions. But so far, the Trump administration, while they haven't done anything super damaging, they haven't done anything progressive on this either.
He's selling the wall now more than ever before as an anti-drug measure. What's going on with that?
That's always been part of it. That's why the wall has to be see-through, right? Because they throw the big bags of drugs over the wall and you might hit the Border Patrol on the head. There's always that risk because obviously the border and drug importation, illicit drug importation has always been kind of intertwined, both to a degree factually and to a degree in the public consciousness. And as he ramps up that rhetoric, there's always that risk that, when he's throwing in all these drug dealers coming across the border, that kind of brings back some of that Anslinger-esque fear of immigrants coming from south of the border with their marijuana trying to corrupt American society. So it could go that far, and he's definitely been hinting at that in the way he discusses as well. Also, though, on the other hand, you had folks like Steve Bannon, I don't know if you've seen this, several months ago, hosted a press conference where the wall would go and suggested they build the wall out of hempcrete. Which was a very weird and surreal press conference. But I think it's possible that they kind of hold both views at the same time.
Wait, what kind of substance is this that we're making the wall out of in the Bannon universe?
Hempcrete. You can make concrete out of the hemp plant, basically by processing it, and it creates a form of concrete that's pretty renewable and resource.
So you could smoke the wall, actually.
I think that might be a problem. Maybe they'll just smoke through the wall. But that's it's emblematic of the Trump Republican mindset, where I think a lot of them have these anti-drug views, but so far have seemed to leave marijuana out of it. We do run the risk as we get into 2020, and we've seen when threatened, Donald Trump seems to only amp his rhetoric up further, that if he sees that as a politically viable avenue, he may go that way. Yeah. But looking at public opinion polls, I think it's also just as likely he sees, and all his advisors see, that doing any sort of crackdown on legal marijuana in this country would really only be to his political detriment, especially with those independent voters who, 60 to 65% support legalization.
And we've seen less drugs or less marijuana, is it, coming across the border? And is that, some people attribute that to our legalization policies? Is that true?
Yes, we generally have seen less marijuana coming across the border, particularly when it comes to states that have allowed legal or medical use that are right on the border, places like Arizona and California. And quite frankly, America now grows the best marijuana in the world. Our technology has gotten to the point where if you're a connoisseur who's looking for quality cannabis, you want American-grown cannabis.
Right on.
And that doesn't quite meet the standards of that stereotypical brick weed that we've associated as coming from south of the border for a while. So they've, like any market, they have intense competition now. If you're in Oregon, for instance, where you could buy an ounce of marijuana, high quality for $40, do you want to go on the illicit market and buy an ounce for $200 of dubious quality? You don't know if it was tested for pesticides. You don't know anything about it. American consumers generally want to know what's in their product and that it's a quality product that's safe, and they want it to be affordable. And as long as we can make sure the legal marijuana market meets those things, the black market will continue to diminish in this country.
It's just one bit of good news after another. Is there anything to be pessimistic about?
I don't think so. I think that there's a lot of things we need to continue to consider and learn as we move forward, because now we have these laboratories of democracy, 10 of them that are moving forward with legal marijuana markets. What works, what doesn't work. I think that generally we should be cautious of only having limited number of licenses that are large-scale licenses and opening it up to giant corporations necessarily who are less caring about the communities they're going to be working in and that have nothing but profit incentive. We should spread out, I think, that generally those licenses. So one, people who were suffering under the drug war have the ability to get into the market and have mom and pop shops, small scale marijuana grows and businesses. We want to make sure that the tax rates are set properly, not too high to continue to let the black market thrive, and not necessarily too low to put the profits completely in the dust and no one wants to partake in the market. So there's a lot of things to consider as we move forward, and I think all this talk about minority inclusion in the industry is an important discussion to have that a lot of states are having, and also that most legalization now should come with things like expungement. So if you are carrying a criminal record for something that is now state legal, we should take that burden off of you. You should no longer have to deal with that.
Does your organization see that as the biggest challenge moving forward, that the regulation of the marijuana industry could end up being too heavy-handed, and the black market will therefore still have a big place because it's not competitive with the black market?
It goes both ways, and it's about finding that happy medium. You don't want to be too heavy-handed, but you don't want to be necessarily the most open regulations in the world, because you have things like, again, some states where they gave out too many licenses. Places are sitting on stockpiles of marijuana they can't feasibly sell. But a lot of that comes back to that we're still in this very strange state-by-state system. If you grow marijuana in Oregon, you have to sell it in Oregon. You can't ship that to California. You can't ship that to other states, which isn't how most industry works in this country. You have areas that are producer regions, and you have areas that are more consumer regions.
Because of laws against interstate commerce, that's federal?
Yes, federal laws against interstate commerce. So currently there is no commerce between the states whatsoever. So you can't ship it between the states if you have excess. If you have a certain product you're making in Oregon that somebody wants in Massachusetts, you can't simply sell it to distributors there. And obviously that feeds into international commerce now that we have Canada has a legal marijuana market north of our border. Mexico is slowly moving towards legalization itself. And by restricting these markets, we've created a lot of interesting problems that ultimately, if there was a nationwide legalization structure where most states had it and we could have that kind of interactivity in the markets, wouldn't exist.
How are we doing in DC? We seem to be in a weird spot. We're both federal, district, and local at the same time. What's going on here?
DC obviously is an incredibly unique situation, and we're not a state. We have some autonomy, but not a lot of it. Congress has the ultimate say on our appropriations and our budget. And since we legalized marijuana in 2014 with Initiative 71, which legalized possession and home cultivation, we haven't been able to move forward on the retail aspect, despite that the city council wants to, the mayor wants to, the people certainly want to. And that's because Representative Andy Harris from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, a Republican, very conservative member of Congress, every year puts a rider on the DC appropriations bill that says DC can expend no funds to regulate the sale or consumption of marijuana, essentially blocking us from ever moving forward on it, even if we wanted to. The good news on that front is, now that the Democratic Party has taken back the House side, which is the one that oversees the appropriation bills at their inception, it's very unlikely that will be included this time. In fact, most of the members of the committee have told us that they're going to fight to keep that out and make sure that stays out. As we've seen with her re-election, Mayor Bowser has said she's more than ready to move forward on this and wants to as soon as she can. So I think in the next several years, we'll see that prohibition on sales in DC go away, and the DC Council will rather expeditiously move to set up a retail market in Washington, DC.
So Kamala Harris giveth, Andy Harris taketh away.
Yes.
Well, thanks for talking to us, Eric. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Eric Altieri, the Executive Director of NORML. I'm Todd Cranen for Reason.